Chapter 7, American Pageant, is Mr. Shea from Notre Dame High School, AP United States History. This chapter is going to lead us right into the Revolutionary War. We start with the deep roots of revolution that was nurtured really by England's policies towards the colonies and the way that the colonies were treated, and also just the way that the colonial um, governments and the colonial society developed over the period of colonization. One important term to remember is republicanism, and this was a very different idea than what was present in Old England, where citizens themselves were willing to be subordinate, to be selfless for the common good. Many became extraordinarily involved in civics, so civic duty. Look at whether it's the House of Burgesses or the Massachusetts Assembly. This idea of everybody, and when we say everybody, we say it loosely, because not everybody had a voice, even in republicanism. But the idea that more people were involved and that the citizens of the country, for the common good, wanted to create laws and wanted to create an environment that was beneficial to all. This clearly rejects traditional noble status in Old England, old estates that where you would have titles and such, and the monarchy. One group in England that actually really supports this idea, the Radical Whigs, they are a minority in they're involved. Some of them are involved in the parliament, some are outside of the parliament. They write articles, they speak out consistently against the fear that the monarchy would become too powerful over the parliament and then the people's voice would be lost. And they are very much into conspiracy theories of how the monarchy is consistently pushing towards those ends. So Whigs are constantly pushing against corruption and the idea of different things that might be being done by the British monarchy to achieve those goals. And this really seeps into the American psyche, especially those like the Sons of Liberty and the revolutionary spirit. They really tie on to these ideas and these suspicions. And the Whigs, when the Revolutionary War starts, really tie into the American revolutionaries and their ideas. That along with the distance, the just sheer distance, we've talked about salutary neglect in the past, but the distance between the homeland and the colonies create or weakens the ability of the central government to assert its authority. Okay, one of the other key concepts here is mercantilism. Mercantilism is the belief that the more gold and silver that a country can acquire, the more powerful it becomes, the stronger the country becomes. And to that end, amassing gold and silver through the acquisition of colonies was a very sound plan, because when you look at colonies, what do they supply? They supply raw materials. So in the American colonies, tobacco is a great example of this. Lumber is a great example of this. All of the staple crops really are great examples of raw materials that could be supplied by the colonies to the motherland. But also, and just as importantly, they guarantee a market to sell finished products in. So when you think about tobacco is not manufactured and put into production in the form of a cigar or a pipe or chewed tobacco. These are not processed and packaged in the colonies. Instead, it's actually done in England, and then these finished products are sold directly back to the colonists. So it's a great new market. And the theory for mercantilism, you're able to create these new markets, which generates tax revenue, which will then eventually lead to gold and silver for the motherland. So England has a policy of salutary neglect, but oftentimes with new leadership or different periods, they would attempt to tighten the control over the colonies. Some examples would be the Navigation Act of 1650, aimed at Dutch shippers, where they were really trying to focus on trade and keeping the trade between the colonies strictly between Britain and the colonists, not allowing the Dutch to intervene and create new marketplaces or a new way for the colonists to distribute their raw materials. Occasionally, certain staple crops like tobacco, which is a major staple crop, Britain wanted to guarantee that they would be the only country that that crop was shipped to. Okay, even though if the colonists wanted to go elsewhere with the crop, they might make more money. Another key to mercantilism would be exporting more than you import, and that was certainly done between England and the colonies. But when you export so much more than you import, which is what England is doing, you're going to create an imbalance in currency. So this policy of mercantilism that the British employed with the colonies created an enormous money shortage in the colonies to the point where the colonists didn't have gold or silver, and so eventually, after, whether they turned to trade or many of them began to print their own currency. The problem with the currency printing is that it's not backed by any real substantial precious metal. British merchants reject it, and laws are passed outlawing the colonial legislatures from printing paper currency. The British Crown also institutes a policy where any law passed in a colonial assembly, like the House of Burgesses, could be vetoed if it would harm the interest of the British government. Even though that's the case, there's a very small sample of this veto taking place. Maybe four or 500 times when there were thousands of laws passed. So it didn't happen too often. All of these different actions along the way with a revolutionary or independent spirit that was beginning to grow in the American colonies fostered resentment towards England. And this picture here is just showing the woman on the left here is representing Old England dressed up in a gown, and the Indian princess on the right representing the American colonists. And you can see the American colonists is striking back a blow at the old, wealthy England. This is just a portrait. I think this is Paul Revere. The reason it's significant is that it's a painting, a portrait, and Paul Revere was not a nobleman. And in England, if you weren't noble or didn't hold a title, then you didn't have your portrait taken. So here's a portrait taken of a man who's showing off his work, what he crafted, and this would be highly unlikely if he were in England. So what were the realities of mercantilism? Even though there were some protests and some resentment, the reality was that Great Britain did not strictly enforce these policies. Again, instead going with a policy of salutary neglect. American traders and merchants were able to trade with others besides Great Britain. This resulted in Great Britain turned a blind eye, because if they were able to trade, they were able to actually bring up their currency levels, their money, their precious metals, and then eventually those would return to Great Britain when finished products were bought from British merchants. So the idea that the mercantilistic economy didn't work completely is false, because American merchants were able to smuggle goods out. They also benefited from protection of the strongest military in the world at the time, and they didn't have to pay for it, since American colonists are not paying taxes at this point to the British government, only paying taxes to themselves within the colonial governments. What were some of the negatives of the mercantilistic system? For one, it would stifle competition. Not as many countries being involved, not as many opportunities. Even though American colonists were able to smuggle certain goods, it still was difficult to do, and they really couldn't open up the doors to all the possibilities. Adam Smith, the father of economics, would say that they were being stifled and not allowed to maximize their earning potential. Colonists also felt, and this would be leading colonists like a Ben Franklin or Sam Adams, John Hancock, felt that they were treated like lesser citizens, like they were treated like adolescents, rather than being treated like countrymen who had equal opportunities to advance themselves. Remember, they believe they're regular citizens. Why should merchants in England be able to trade with anybody they want, and the colonists, who are supposed to have equal rights, prevented to do so? So after the 7 Years' War, the French Indian War, England begins to shift its policy under Prime Minister George Grenville. All of a sudden, the policy of salutary neglect goes away. Navigation laws are strictly enforced, and Parliament agrees that the colonists should take on some of the costs of not only the French and Indian War, but also future protection moving forward. So they're going to begin to tax the colonists. This is a radical shift, and it's going to begin the Revolutionary Era. So the first tax is the Sugar Act in 1764. It's the first one passed to raise tax revenue in the colonies for the English crown, so that's significant in and of itself. There were protests early on because of the how much the tax was. The Parliament decided to reduce the tax to kind of appease the colonists, but they were still a little bit upset. So what they did is then initiate the Quartering Act in 1765, and what a Quartering Act does is it makes it mandatory for colonists to house, feed, supply British soldiers. So now the British are beginning to bring some soldiers, even as early as 1765, to the colonies in larger numbers, or the ones that were left over from the French Indian War, and colonists are expected to pay for them to be around, to let them stay in their homes, share their meals. The stamp tax. This would be the one of the biggest taxes in the Revolutionary Era because it led to so much debate, and it led to a lot of unity. Well, it starts out with the actual tax, which mandates taxes, a stamp be put on, which you'd have to pay for, a tax on over 50 goods, including playing cards, any letter, any court document, marriage license, real estate contract. Each one of these would have a stamp associated with them. The colonists are outraged by this, but remember, in England they had a stamp tax also, and that stamp tax was 3 times the amount of what it was in the colonies. Grenville and Parliament couldn't understand why the colonists would feel that this was a bad deal, that they should understand their obligation to pay for their protection. But colonists looked at it as a slap in the face after the French and Indian War, where they really didn't have the opportunity to move west initially when they were promised that. They see an overstepping central government that, remember, has practiced a completely different policy over the last century, all of a sudden initiating new, stricter laws along with the navigation law, now this Stamp Act, where their rights are being infringed upon. In addition to the stamp tax, admiralty courts were put into effect where you were not allowed anymore, or in some courts, not all of them, we say in John Adams, but some courts would not have juries. They would just be English judges. The colonists looked at the admiralty courts as well as the presence of the Navy and British soldiers as a clear sign of conspiracy, maybe a moving in of very tight control. And if we remember what the Whigs were saying in England, this kind of fit into that superstitious or paranoia that the British Crown was going to overstep its boundaries. So did the Americans believe they should be independent at this point? No, they did not. Did they believe that the British Crown couldn't pass legislation, which are passing laws that would dictate rules in the colonies? No, but they did believe that the British government did not have the ability to legislate taxes on the colonies, since they did not have representation in Parliament. The colonists have no vote to elect a representative from a district or from a colony or a town or anything like that. So they look at the taxes as unfair because they don't have a voice to speak up against these taxes in Parliament like any other English citizen would have. Grenville argued that they did in fact have representation. It was virtual representation, that even though Parliament members were elected from districts all across England, once they were a Parliament member, their job and their duty was not just to their district or area, but to all Englishmen. So by that theory, the Parliament was looking after the colonists, just like they were looking after everybody in England. Colonists rejected this claim. They at this point become very enraged and very active in their revolutionary spirit, which we'll see here on this slide. Politically, they organized the Stamp Act Congress in 1765. And here they draw up, and this is a big deal because it shows unification of colonists. It shows them being able to establish clear leadership within the colonies, and it shows a willingness to stick their necks out there and really oppose the king and parliament. So they send a statement of rights and grievances. They send another letter asking to repeal the legislation, but the Stamp Act Congress was paid no attention to in England. When did they really get the attention of the English government? It's when they brought economics into the fray with the non-importation agreements that the colonists, the leaders, signed with each other, which put a ban on importing all British goods. Remember that the British economy is thriving because of their ability to export their finished products, their finished tobacco, their finished clothes, all these goods that are being exported back to the colonies, and is allowing for the British economy to thrive so much. All of a sudden, the American colonists together are going to say they will not import those goods. They won't buy those goods. This is incredible unity over a large, vast amount of land, 13 colonies. At first, Georgia's not going to participate, but eventually they will. And it shows a willingness to protest again against the English government. In addition to the economic protest, you have the formation of the Sons and Daughters of Liberty. They're really revolutionary vigilantes. They take the law into their own hands. Tarring and feathering was a common action where they would melt hot tar. If you were a tax collector, they would gather you up, pour the hot tar over you, and then they would douse you with feathers to make you walk around in shame. They were so effective that by 1765, 1766, virtually there's no tax collectors because they're all scared and intimidated of what might happen to them. In 1766, as a result of no tax collectors and the boycott, two very effective means of protest, the Stamp Act is repealed. Parliament, though, is very upset. Grenville's upset. King George is upset that the colonists are acting this way when they feel that it's their duty to participate also in the expenses of England. They, in turn, pass a Declaratory Act, and all the Declaratory Act really does is reaffirm the sovereignty that the British government has over the colonies. They have complete control and the ability to pass any law whatsoever at any time. So they're saying, okay, we'll take away the Stamp Act, but just remember, we won't do this again, and we can do whatever we want in the future. Just a few picture slides here. There's a demonstration of tarring and feathering. You can see the tax collector there. In this case, this is a prelude also to the Boston Tea Party, but you see on the tree, the Liberty Tree, Stamp Act sign is turned upside down. This would be the Sons of Liberty who are conducting this. The Townshend Acts. The Townshend Acts start out, it's another tax, but it's a lesser tax because it's non-direct. It's not directed at individual colonists. It's indirect. It happens at the ports in the form of customs. So it will raise prices, but the colonists won't feel it out of their own pockets necessarily until they buy the finished good. Colonists are still upset. They understand that it's still taxes without representation. Especially when they heard that the taxes that they were going to pay were going to go to royal governors, which would lessen again their power, because remember, the colonial legislatures pay the royal governor's salary, and now these salaries are going to come from this tax, giving the royal governors more control over the colonists and less dependence on the colonial legislatures. So the non-importation acts are revised against the Townshend Acts, but one thing to remember, the Townshend Acts, they really take the form early on of being just like the old navigation laws that were ignored. Colonists don't pay too much attention. Smuggling tea for cheaper prices starts to pick up again. And so the British see what's going on. They don't want a policy of salutary neglect again. And they actually send regiments, 2 regiments of troops to Boston in 1768. And March 5th, 1770, the inevitable happens with the Boston Massacre, probably orchestrated by the Sons of Liberty intentionally to create a propaganda campaign against the British military being in Boston. With the trial, which we're watching now in the video, and John Adams, in the movie, all are acquitted, but in the reality, 2 redcoats were found guilty, but they only received a branding on their hands and were sent back to England. These are I'm going to show you 2 depictions of the Boston Massacre. This is Paul Revere's. Notice that the colonists looked very helpless in this one. There's a clear order to fire here by the captain of the British troops. You even see the church clearly in the background. A little puppy that's in the picture. This is all to invoke sympathy for the colonists. Here is probably a little bit more accurate depiction where the colonists, who are rope makers, have clubs. You can see the clubs are being thrown. The British soldiers are defending themselves, and it looks much more like a scene of a riot versus the first picture. But this first picture was used and circulated throughout the colonies and in England. It was used by the Whigs in England for their propaganda campaign, and used throughout the colonies to unite and draw support. King George III was a young king. He was 32 years old. He was trying to establish himself. He was very smart, not a bad person by all accounts, but he had bad people around him, scheming individuals around him, including Lord North, who was his prime minister. So the Townshend Acts are really timed poorly. They almost led to rebellion, but they didn't. Parliament does repeal the Townshend Acts, but continues on with really in trying to enforce the navigation laws. And this pushes the Sons of Liberty even further, including Sam Adams. Sam Adams becomes one of the leaders in Boston of the Sons of Liberty, the leading voice in the revolutionary era at the First and Second Continental Congress, and his cousin, John Adams, we're going to talk about in a second, also becomes highly involved. Sam Adams is given credit with organizing committees of correspondence. These would be the network with which the Revolutionary War, the communication pre-Revolutionary War and during the Revolutionary War, it's a network of communication among the colonies and the colonial leaders. It starts in Boston. Remember that England now has put new laws and restrictions on some meetings. Not as bad as it's going to get, but they already have put some restrictions on it. These are secret meetings. A lot of times it would happen in churches or town halls, where they would communicate to their leaders the issues and problems. They would also organize training of military, shipping of military goods, supplies, food. Eventually, these committees spread all through the 13 colonies, and it's from these committees that the First Continental and the Second Continental Congress are actually organized. It's a picture of Sam Adams. That's Abigail Adams. Okay, so the Boston Tea Party, it starts out with the British East India Company. If you think of the British East India Company, thinking about a major corporation in America today, where the government deems it's too big to fail. It provides too many jobs, too much tax revenue, and the government would really be hurt if it failed. The British East India Company was just that, and it was facing bankruptcy, and it had so much unsold product that it needed to unload it, otherwise it would go out of business, and the British government would lose that tax revenue. So the British government gives the British East India Company exclusive rights to sell their tea in the American colonies. And even though this tea is cheaper than the other tea that they were drinking, they saw it just on principle as a violation of their rights. They see it as an attempt, again, if you go back to the Whigs, the conspiracy theorists of the British government imposing its will on the American colonists. So the British colonists, the American colonists, not only Massachusetts, we focus on the Boston Tea Party, but tea was confiscated in several colonies, burned, resold, saved. In certain ports like Maryland or Baltimore, they were just forced to. They faced shooting and cannon fire, and the ships were forced out of the harbor. But in Boston, Thomas Hutchinson, the governor, was determined that the tea was going to come in, and he wasn't going to let anything else in or out of the harbor until the tea was actually unloaded. So the Sons of Liberty took this as a challenge. They dressed up as Indians, snuck out into the harbor, boarded the ships, and dumped 342 chests of tea into the ocean. As people cheered on the side, it became known as the Boston Tea Party. Some colonists saw this as a great thing, and they realized that this was extremely bold move that was going on through the colonies. Many colonists supported this. They were the ones who became known as your patriots. And then there were others who looked at it as a perilous path that would only lead to Britain acting out its revenge somehow in the colonies. And these were known as Tories, otherwise known as Loyalists. A couple of pictures from the Boston Tea Party. As a response to Boston, primarily, the British respond with the Intolerable Acts in 1774. It's a series of acts, very harsh and especially focused on Boston Harbor. The Boston Port Act closed the harbor until the damages were paid from the Boston Tea Party. Remember that the Boston Harbor is their entire source of income in that area. It is their livelihood. To close that would end them economically. It was extremely devastating. They also took away the colonial charter. They changed the rules so that if a British soldier were to shoot and kill an American colonist, he would be sent back to Britain for trial. Again, think of the Whigs' conspiracy theory. This would, they would believe they would just be let off without any punishment. And they had a new quartering act, so you had British soldiers in the area again. The Quebec Act in 1774 had nothing to do with the Intolerable Acts, but just had bad timing. It gives French in this area more land. It gives the right to practice the Catholic religion. This is just, it seems like they're connected, even though they're not. It was just very poor timing and outraged many Protestant New Englanders. Okay. So the First Continental Congress, we talk about Lexington and Concord, which I'm going to skip ahead to. I'll stay right here. The First Continental Congress meets in 1774. Again, Georgia's not represented, but Sam Adams and John Adams from Boston were there. George Washington, Patrick Henry, Ben Franklin was at the First Continental Congress. They are united and declare their grievances to the king. At the First Continental Congress, there's still no talk of independence. They're not writing laws. They're just trying to consult to see what the next step should be. They appeal to the king with an olive branch petition, hoping to avoid any real conflict, but obviously to have the Intolerable Acts and the Boston Port Act lifted on Boston. They did call for the association, which called for a British boycott of all British goods, including not only importing, but exporting and non-consumption. So no use in any way of British goods, no trading with Britain in any way. Parliament and the king rejected the olive branch petition. At this point, it became clear that war may happen, and the armament of the colonists, especially in Boston, began to take place, but also in other colonies as well. In 1775, Lexington and Concord takes place. Initially, it's just a slaughter at Lexington where the British regulars were out looking for Sam Adams and John Hancock, and also looking for arms supplies, guns, and ammo. The first shots are fired at Lexington Square, but upon going to Concord and not finding any arms on the way back, the British are attacked and surrounded by American colonists who had militiamen who had organized quickly, and as a result, many British soldiers were killed. So going into the Revolutionary War, that's the beginning of the Revolutionary War. What were the strengths and weaknesses of both sides? Britain had 7.5 million to 2.5 million colonists. They had a lot more money, a professional army, and a navy. They also had the help of paid soldiers called Hessians, which included 30,000 Germans. But Britain was not as strong as everybody would think. They also had to concern themselves with Ireland, who was constantly a threat and required troops to keep the peace there. France was always a threat to invade if they sensed any weakness, and France would help out the American colonists, first with loans, supplies, training, but later with navy and troops. The London government wasn't together as much as it should have been. There was no strong leadership. The Whigs were an opposing party within the government, and many people did not want to take up arms against their own brethren in the colonies. What were some other weaknesses? Well, Britain had to fight so far from home, so their supply lines would be very difficult for them to move supplies. Their communication lines were hampered as well. Orders that would come from England wouldn't reach the colonies until those orders were really at that point dated and no longer valid. And it was hard for them to find provisions from American colonists, because again, who's going to support them? Although some did, and they sold these goods at much more expensive rates and profited off the war, but it was still difficult for them to find food and supplies. In order for Britain to win, another weakness is they had to completely conquer 13 colonies over a vast space of land. This is very difficult to do. They had to not only conquer these colonies, collect their leadership, and there really wasn't a specific point, a specific city like Paris in France or London in England, where if they conquered it, the war would end. America didn't really have that type of city. So the American pluses, they had great leadership. George Washington, Ben Franklin, John Adams, very talented, young, innovative thinkers. They had a revolutionary spirit, although not everybody was a patriot. You had plenty of Tories or other people who just stayed out of the war. France would get involved eventually with foreign aid, again in the form of money, loans, supplies, and then eventually the military. Lafayette, who was not only a great trainer of troops, French commander, but also loaned $200,000, which was instrumental in the colonial defense. So even though America was outnumbered, they were fighting in their own country. They had plenty of supplies. Agriculturally, they could feed their troops. Although, in the winters it was very harsh, they would lack in clothing to keep warm, and they would lack in military supplies until the French began to help them out. Some of the troubles that they faced, the lack of metallic money. So again, we have the printing of currencies, which becomes useless. The idea of continental, if it's worth a continental or worth less than a continental money became worthless during the time due to inflation of paper money. And so currencies skyrocketed, and debt collectors were frustrated when individuals would pay them off in this newly appreciated currency. So it did hurt the economy, and it made times very difficult during the war. For the most part, the Second Continental Congress governed over the colonies during the war until the Articles of Confederation are written in 1781. Some other issues they faced. People, although they were unified, the colonies were still distinctly different in the South, the Middle, and the New England. Who was leading? Jealousy was always a problem. Just Lafayette. Okay. Just another quick example in Valley Forge, where the soldiers go without food for 3 consecutive days in the cruel winter. Many die, many become sick and diseased. We'll talk more about that in Chapter 8 when we go into the battles of the Revolutionary War. One other point on this slide, manufactured goods were in short supply. Remember that America had not established a manufacturing infrastructure because all the goods were manufactured in England. That was part of the mercantilistic economy. That's how it was set up. So America really had to set up all these different structures and methods during the war. Women traveled with their husbands and sons during the war. They tried to sew clothes. Some actually fought. Many worked as nurses. They became known as camp followers. You also had African Americans who did fight on both sides during the war. Many for the North came from the northern states. They were paid. At first, they were told they couldn't fight, and then it was clear that that didn't make any sense. The British offered black loyalists their freedom if they fought in the war, and so they did actually recruit quite a few black loyalists from the South to fight in the Revolutionary War. As I mentioned before, some people took advantage. Not everybody was a patriot. Many American profiteers made a lot of money by overcharging for goods that were in high demand due to shortages of a war. Okay, that's Chapter 7. Good luck on the quiz.